The thing about men like Jimmy Burke is that they don't disappear in a blaze of glory. They fade out in silence, rotting in places no one wants to talk about. And if you only watched Goodfellas, you'd think his story ended with handcuffs and a prison sentence. Neat and cinematic, almost poetic. But the truth is uglier, slower, and far more brutal than Hollywood ever dared to show, because Burke didn't just fall, he decayed, piece by piece, in a system built to forget men like him. And that's where this story really begins, not at the height of his power in the late 1970s, not during the infamous Lufthansa heist at JFK Airport in December 1978, but in the quiet aftermath, when the empire he built on fear and loyalty started collapsing under its own weight, because Jimmy Burke wasn't just a thief or a gangster. He was a product of a system where violence was currency, paranoia was survival, and loyalty was something you enforced, not something you trusted. Born in 1931 and raised in foster homes across New York, Burke grew up learning one simple rule. Nobody was coming to save you. And that kind of childhood doesn't just disappear, it hardens you, shapes the way you see the world. And by the time he found his way into the orbit of the Lucchese crime family, he wasn't looking for belonging, he was looking for control, and he got it, slowly at first, running hijackings, organizing crews, building a reputation, not just as someone who could make money, but as someone who could make problems disappear, permanently. And that reputation is what eventually made him indispensable, especially to men like Henry Hill and Tommy DeSimone, who saw in Burke both a mentor and a ticking time bomb, because Jimmy had a way of smiling while calculating how useful you were. And once that usefulness ran out, so did your time. And that's the part most people don't understand about the mafia. Not the suits, not the dinners, not the flashy robberies, but the constant, suffocating pressure to stay valuable. Because the moment you became a liability, you were already dead, you just didn't know it yet. And Burke understood this better than most, which is exactly why the Lufthansa heist was both his greatest triumph and the beginning of his end, pulling off one of the largest cash robberies in American history. Over $5 million in cash and nearly $1 million in jewelry. It should have secured his place as a legend, but instead, it triggered something far more dangerous: paranoia. Because big money brings big attention, and attention is the one thing the mafia can't afford, especially when the FBI starts circling and suddenly every guy involved becomes a potential informant. Every loose end becomes a threat, and Burke, true to form, didn't hesitate. One by one, the people connected to the heist started turning up dead. Louis Cafra, Joe Buddha Manry, Marty Krugman. Men who had celebrated together just weeks earlier were now being found in dumpsters, cars, shallow graves. Because in Jimmy Burke's world, silence wasn't just golden, it was mandatory. And if you couldn't guarantee it, you were eliminated. No second chances, no negotiations, just gone. And at first it worked. The witnesses disappeared, the trail went cold, and Burke tightened his grip on what remained of the operation. But what he didn't account for was the one thing no gangster ever truly controls: time. Because time changes people, it erodes loyalty, it introduces fear, and eventually, it forces decisions. And that's exactly what happened to Henry Hill, the same man who once idolized Burke, who saw him as a father figure, now watching his bodies piled up around him, realizing that proximity to Jimmy wasn't protection. It was a countdown. And when Hill got arrested in 1980 on drug charges, something shifted, because now he was facing decades in prison. And for the first time, the code of silence didn't feel noble. It felt suicidal. And that's the crack the system can't fix, because the mafia relies on loyalty, but it enforces it through fear. And fear doesn't last forever. Eventually, survival takes over. And when it does, even the most loyal soldiers start talking. And when Henry Hill became an informant, it didn't just expose Burke, it dismantled everything he had built, piece by piece, testimony by testimony, revealing the inner workings of his crew, the robberies, the murders, the system itself. And suddenly, Jimmy Burke, the man who had spent his entire life staying one step ahead, found himself cornered, arrested in 1982, not for Lufthansa, not directly, but for the murder of Richard Eaton. A smaller case that finally stuck, because that's another truth Hollywood rarely emphasizes. You don't always go down for the biggest crime. You go down for the one they can prove. And when the verdict came in, Burke was sentenced to 20 years to life, a punishment that, on the surface, seemed almost manageable for a man like him. Because prison, in mafia mythology, is just another chapter, another place where power can be negotiated, alliances can be formed, and influence can still be maintained, but that illusion doesn't hold up forever, especially not for someone like Jimmy Burke, because the system he thrived in on the outside doesn't translate the same way behind bars. And as the years went on, the man who once controlled millions, who orchestrated one of the most daring heists in history, who decided who lived and who died, began to fade into something else. Entirely. Something quieter, something weaker, and far more disturbing than any cinematic ending. Because the real story of Jimmy Burke isn't about how he rose. It's about how he unraveled, slowly, painfully, and almost completely forgotten. And what happened next is something Goodfellas never showed. Because it wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fast, and it definitely wasn't something you'd want to watch. By the time Jimmy Burke settled into the long, grinding reality of prison life in the early 1980s, the mythology he had spent decades building around himself was already starting to crack. Because outside, he had been a man who controlled chaos. But inside, chaos was the system itself, and no amount of reputation could fully shield him from that, especially when the world he once dominated had moved on without him. Because that's the unspoken rule of organized crime. When you're locked away, you're not a boss, you're a memory, and memories don't earn. They don't command, they don't protect, and Burke, for the first time in his life, was forced into a position he had always avoided. Irrelevance. And that's a far more dangerous place for a man like him than any street corner or courtroom, because irrelevance breeds desperation, and desperation changes behavior. And behind bars, Burke tried to adapt the only way he knew how, by asserting control through intimidation, manipulation, and the careful construction of alliances. But prison isn't the street, and it isn't a nightclub in Queens where a look or a whisper could end someone's life without consequence. Because in prison, everyone has a reputation, everyone has nothing left to lose, and violence isn't strategic. It's constant, unpredictable, and often meaningless, which stripped away the calculated precision that made Burke so effective on the outside. And what replaced it was something far less stable, a slow burning aggression that began to surface in ways even his closest associates would have found unsettling. Because without money flowing, without operations to run, without the daily reinforcement of power, Burke was left alone with the one thing he had spent his entire life avoiding: himself. And that's where the real deterioration began, not in a single dramatic moment, but in small, almost invisible shifts. Stories from inmates and guards describing a man who was increasingly volatile, increasingly paranoid, someone who still carried the aura of danger, but no longer had the structure to contain it. And in the mafia world, structure is everything. It's what turns violence into business, what turns chaos into profit. But strip that away, and what you're left with is just a man who knows how to destroy, with no outlet, no purpose, and no exit. And over time, that kind of existence starts to rot a person from the inside out. And for Burke, the rot wasn't just psychological, it became physical. Because prison has a way of accelerating decline, especially for men who live hard, fast lives on the outside. And while Hollywood often romanticizes the idea of mobsters running things from behind bars, the reality is far more mundane and far more brutal. Because influence fades, connections weaken, and eventually, even the most feared names become just another inmate number. And Burke felt that shift more than most, because his entire identity was built on control, and now control was something he could only pretend to have. And that pretense became harder to maintain as the years went on, especially as the consequences of his past decisions continued to ripple through the system. Because while he was serving time for the murder of Richard Eaton, the shadow of the Lufthansa heist never really left him. Not in the eyes of law enforcement, not in the whispers of other inmates, and certainly not in his own mind. Because every man he had eliminated to protect himself was now a ghost he couldn't outrun. And that's another truth about the mafia that rarely gets explored. The violence doesn't end when the crime is over. It lingers, it reshapes you, it isolates you. And for Burke, isolation became the defining feature of his later years. not because he was physically alone, but because trust, the one thing he had manipulated so effectively on the outside, was now completely absent. Because who do you trust when your entire life has been built on betrayal? When you know better than anyone how easy it is to flip, to talk, to survive at someone else's expense. And that paranoia, once a tool, became a prison inside the prison, a constant, gnawing presence that made every interaction suspect, every conversation a potential threat. And it didn't help that the very system he had served, the Lucchese family, the broader structure of organized crime, had no real incentive to protect him anymore. Because from their perspective, Burke was a liability, a man tied to one of the most high-profile robberies in American history, a man connected to a wave of murders that drew intense federal attention. And most importantly, a man who was no longer earning. And in that world, if you're not earning, you're not worth the risk. And that's the cold, mechanical logic of the mafia system. It's not about loyalty in the way most people understand it. It's about utility, about what you bring to the table right now. And once that's gone, so are you, at least in any meaningful sense. And Burke, who had once enforced that very rule, was now living under it, watching as the connections he once relied on slowly evaporated. Visits became less frequent, communication more distant, and the outside world, the one he had spent decades shaping through fear and money, became something abstract, almost unreal. And that disconnect only deepened the sense that his life, as he had known it, was over long before his sentence would ever end. And yet, despite all of this, there was no dramatic breaking point, no cinematic confession or moment of clarity, because real life doesn't work that way, especially not for men like Burke. Instead, there was just a gradual decline, a wearing down of the persona he had built, until what remained was something far less imposing. A man still capable of violence, still dangerous in the right context, but no longer the architect of grand schemes, no longer the man orchestrating multi-million-dollar heists. Just another aging inmate, navigating a system that didn't care who he used to be. And that's where the real brutality of his story starts to reveal itself. Not in the crimes he committed, but in the consequences he couldn't escape, because prison didn't just take his freedom. It took his identity, stripped it down, exposed the emptiness beneath the power, and forced him to confront a reality that no gangster movie ever truly captures. That the end isn't a shootout or a betrayal in some smoky back room. It's a slow, suffocating erosion of everything you once were. And for Jimmy Burke, that erosion was far from over. Because what happened next would push him even further away from the legend he had become, into something much darker, much more human, and far more disturbing than anyone on the outside ever realized. By the late 1980s and into the mid-1990s, what remained of Jimmy Burke was no longer the man people whispered about in back rooms or feared in dimly lit clubs across Queens, but something far more unsettling, a living reminder of what the mafia does to its own when the usefulness runs out. Because Burke didn't go out in a blaze of violence or a final act of defiance. He simply withered, physically and mentally, inside a system that grinds men down until there's nothing left but fragments of who they used to be. And that's the part Goodfellas never showed, because it doesn't fit the rhythm of a crime story. There's no adrenaline in decay, no glamour in a man losing himself day by day. But that's exactly what happened. As years of incarceration, stress, and a lifetime of excess began to catch up with him, his health deteriorating in ways that no amount of intimidation or reputation could stop. Because prison doesn't care who you were, it only cares who you are right now. And Burke, once a man who controlled millions, now struggled with something as simple and as cruel as survival, reportedly developing serious health issues including lung cancer, a slow and painful illness that stripped away whatever illusion of control he still clung to. Because there's no negotiating with something like that. No deal to be made, no leverage to use, just time running out. And in those final years, the mythology surrounding him had all but disappeared, replaced by the quiet reality of an aging inmate facing the consequences of a life built entirely on taking from others. Because that's the hidden cost of the mafia system. It gives you everything quickly, power, money, respect, but it takes it back slowly, piece by piece, until you're left with nothing but the memory of what it once felt like. And Burke's end reflects that perfectly, because there was no grand reckoning, no dramatic courtroom speech, no final betrayal that tied everything together. Just a hospital bed within the prison system, a body failing under the weight of decades of violence and stress, and a man who, despite everything he had done, despite all the fear he had inspired, was ultimately just another inmate number nearing the end of his sentence in the most irreversible way possible. And when he died in 1996 at the age of 64, it didn't shake the underworld. It didn't send ripples through the Lucchese family. It barely registered outside of those who already knew his story, because by then, Jimmy Burke wasn't a figure of power anymore. He was a cautionary tale. And that's the truth the movies avoid, because it forces you to confront something uncomfortable about the entire system. That it's not designed to create legends. It's designed to consume people, to use them for as long as they're profitable, and then discard them without ceremony. And Burke, who had spent his entire life enforcing that exact principle on others, became one of its most perfect examples, because everything he did to maintain control, every murder, every act of paranoia, every decision to eliminate a perceived threat, only accelerated the inevitable, isolating him further, making him more expendable, and ensuring that when the time came, there would be no one left to protect him, no one left to remember him in the way he might have imagined. And that's where the psychological core of his story really hits, because men like Burke don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as survivors, as products of a world that forced them to adapt or die. And in many ways, that's true. His childhood, the foster homes, the lack of stability, all of it shaped the man he became. But the mafia doesn't just exploit that kind of background. It amplifies it. It rewards the worst instincts, violence, distrust, dominance, and then traps you in a cycle where those instincts are the only tools you have left. And eventually, those same tools become the reason you fall. Because a system built on fear can never truly sustain loyalty. It can only delay betrayal. And Burke's entire empire was built on that delay. A ticking clock disguised as control. And when it finally ran out, there was no dramatic collapse, just a slow fade into obscurity and suffering. And that's the brutal truth behind his fate. Not the rise, not the heist, not even the murders, but the ending, because it strips away the illusion that there's anything glamorous about this life, that there's some kind of honor or legacy waiting at the end. When in reality, the end looks like a hospital ward, a forgotten name, and a story that only survives because others lived long enough to tell it. And maybe that's why films like Goodfellas stop where they do, because going further forces you to sit with the consequences, to see the system for what it really is, not a brotherhood, not a code, but a machine that turns people into assets, and then into ghosts. And Jimmy Burke, once one of its most efficient operators, became one of those ghosts. Long before he ever died, his real fate not defined by the crimes he committed, but by the slow, inevitable unraveling that followed. And in the end, that's the story that lingers. Not the money, not the power, but the silence that comes after, when everything is gone and there's nothing left to control.